The Galactic Academy's survival hall was a cavern of glass and steel, buried deep within the moon of Kirillth, designed to simulate the harshest ecosystems known to intelligent life. Its air was kept cold enough to mist when exhaled, and faint trails of frost glittered on the transparent floor panels. Every cadet who entered the hall felt the atmosphere change, a hum of anticipation mixed with dread. Elias Ward walked among them quietly, clutching his issued thermal wrap under one arm while his breath clouded before him. The others chatted in low tones, their alien accents merging into a discordant buzz of languages and clicks. He was the only human in the group, and his silence made him stand out more than he liked. The lesson's announcement had already circulated through the dormitories. Today's exercise would involve live Varkin cubs. Those words alone were enough to unsettle the bravest cadet. The Varkin were notorious across the sectors, predatory creatures from the frost world Hadris Prime, born with bone-plated skulls and temperaments sharper than their fangs. Full-grown Varkin hunted in coordinated packs that could bring down armored beasts twice their size. Even the cubs, barely half a meter tall, were dangerous. The idea that students would share a room with them seemed like madness, but the Academy's motto was simple. Understanding conquers fear. Elias wasn't sure he believed that anymore. The instructor arrived in a sharp hiss of air as the side door opened. Commander Varkesh was a cold-blooded reptilian, a towering figure covered in dull green scales that looked like forged metal plates. His eyes were narrow slits of gold, unblinking, and his voice scraped like steel when he spoke. "Cadets," he hissed, scanning the semicircle of students. "Today we explore control. Control over instinct, control over fear, and control over those who would otherwise control you." His taloned hand swept toward 3 reinforced crates at the center of the room. Each crate trembled faintly, accompanied by a low, guttural sound that reminded Elias of a dog growling through a muzzle. The instructor's tongue flicked in satisfaction at the student's unease. "Inside these containers," he continued, "are 3 Varkin cubs, barely 2 months old. Their instincts are unrefined. Their teeth, however, are not. You will not harm them. You will not use your species' tricks or weapons. You will demonstrate dominance, or you will demonstrate weakness. Nature decides which you are." The crates thudded once more, making the frost dust scatter across the floor. Elias took a slow breath, feeling the sharp chill burn his throat. Around him, cadets of every imaginable form adjusted their stances. An insectoid extended its claws, a feathered avian folded its wings tightly, and a crystalline being hummed a low frequency to calm its own nerves. Varkesh's eyes flicked toward Elias. "And you, human, you survived your species' test planets with little more than sticks and skin, yes? Let us see if that primitive ingenuity helps you when instinct stands before you." The remark drew a quiet hiss of laughter from a few alien students. Elias didn't answer. He simply nodded and stepped back slightly, unrolling his thermal blanket to check for tears. He had repaired it the night before, sewing a loose seam with dental floss from his survival kit. The cloth smelled faintly of ozone and oil. Varkesh circled the group, his tail dragging a faint line in the frost. "You will each have a chance to interact. The cubs respond first to scent, second to temperature, and last to sound. If you misunderstand those priorities, you will bleed. Do not expect medical assistance until the lesson concludes." He reached a control panel on the wall and tapped it with a claw. The ceiling lights dimmed to a deep blue, mimicking the dusk of Hadris Prime. A cold breeze filled the hall, dropping the temperature further until Elias's hands began to numb. The soundproof glass surrounding the hall shimmered faintly, sealing them in. The first crate shuddered violently, and a small metallic hiss echoed as its locks disengaged. The door creaked open a few centimeters, releasing a puff of cold mist. A narrow snout pushed through the gap, scaled, ridged, and lined with rows of needle-like teeth. The creature inside snarled low, its eyes reflecting the dim light like liquid amber. Varkesh's mouth curled into something that might have been a smile. "Observe," he said softly, and motioned for the first cadet to step forward, A tall insectoid named Thurza advanced confidently, her chitin gleaming under the blue light. She emitted a pheromonal mist designed to signal dominance among her species, but the cub immediately responded with a snapping lunge, clamping its jaws around the edge of her lower limb armor. Sparks flew where teeth met chitin. Thurza hissed in pain and stumbled backward. The cub released her and paced in a slow circle, tail twitching. Varkesh nodded in approval. Lesson 1. Instinct respects no scent but its own, he said, pressing another control to open the next crate. A second cub emerged, smaller but quicker, its fur bristling. Another cadet, this one scaled and heavily muscled, tried to assert dominance through posture, standing tall, spreading arms wide, and letting out a deep growl. The cub responded with an even louder growl, its spines rising along its back. It darted forward, raking claws across the cadet's leg before retreating. The scent of blood hit the air. The instructor's eyes gleamed. "Dominance fails when it mirrors threat," he said coldly. Elias stood still, watching the cub's movements carefully. Their aggression wasn't random, it was fear. The temperature was dropping fast, and the frost along the walls thickened into sheets. The cubs' bodies were small, not yet adapted to prolonged exposure, and their breathing was rapid, uneven. He could see the condensation forming on their flanks as they exhaled, tiny puffs of vapor vanishing into the freezing air. He realized the exercise wasn't just about control, it was about stress. Varkesh wanted to provoke them until they broke, then watch who among the cadets survived the chaos. The instructor tapped the third crate's panel. "Now, the last of the litter," he announced, his tone heavy with amusement. The crate opened slowly, revealing the smallest cub yet. It trembled, its fur dull with frost. When the latch clicked, it didn't attack. It only crouched, ears flat, shivering. Varkesh looked displeased. "Defective," he muttered, and turned toward Elias. "Human. Let us see if your species' warmth amounts to anything more than talk." Every eye turned to Elias as he stepped forward. His boots squeaked against the frozen floor, each step deliberate. The air felt dense and sharp. He stopped 3 meters from the cub and knelt slowly, lowering himself until he was at its eye level. He didn't raise his voice or extend his hands. He just breathed, slow and steady, letting warm fog roll from his lips. The cub's head tilted slightly, nostrils flaring. The other 2 cubs, still pacing restlessly, began to quiet. Varkesh said nothing, perhaps curious. Elias slipped his thermal wrap from his shoulders and folded it across his knees, keeping his movements smooth. He didn't look the cub directly in the eyes. He had learned long ago that in most species, eye contact was a challenge. Instead, he focused on the floor between them and stayed perfectly still. Minutes passed. The temperature continued to fall. The cub's trembling grew worse until it took a hesitant step forward, then another. Elias felt the first brush of fur against his leg. The creature's body was shockingly cold to the touch. He resisted the urge to move and simply adjusted the blanket slightly so that a corner covered part of its back. The cub stayed there, breathing shallowly. A low sound escaped its throat, not a growl, but something close to a sigh. Elias's heartbeat slowed, syncing with its rhythm. Behind the glass observation panels, the alien cadets watched in silence. For the first time, even Varkesh did not speak. The instructor's golden eyes flicked between the cub and the human, and though his expression remained unreadable, there was a glint of something like uncertainty. The cub finally lowered itself completely, curling its tail around its body. Frost gathered on the floor around them, the mist of their breath rising together. The hall was silent except for the faint hum of environmental systems and the soft purring that came from the cub's chest. Elias didn't smile. He knew better than to think the moment meant victory. The real test, he suspected, had only just begun. The frost hadn't yet melted from the metal floor when the next phase of the experiment began. The cub that had curled against Elias's knee now slept quietly inside its crate, sealed again after Varkesh had ordered a temporary halt. The other cadets were still murmuring about what they had just witnessed. Some whispered that it was luck, others that the cub had been too weak to attack. Varkesh, however, said nothing for several minutes. He stood before the console, his scaled back to the students, his claws tapping a cold rhythm on the glass screen. His silence was heavier than his voice. The room's lights brightened again, shifting from cold blue to a sterile white. "Phase 2, he announced finally, his voice echoing sharply through the hall. The humans' interaction produced an anomaly. Varkin cubs should not exhibit submissive behavior unless exposed to pheromonal dominance. The data must be verified. Elias straightened his spine but said nothing. He knew better than to interrupt. Each cadet, Varkesh continued, will now engage with the cubs simultaneously. The environment will simulate open-field exposure under stress conditions. Temperature will drop to native Hadris Prime standards, minus 42 degrees by your human scale. The command console emitted a hum, and cold vapor spilled from the vents, swirling around the students' feet like pale fog. The glass walls became opaque as frost thickened across them. Elias's breath turned to ice crystals that drifted past his face before dissolving in the dry air. He wrapped the thermal blanket tighter around his shoulders, feeling its faint heat pulse through the fibers. One by one, the crates opened again. The cubs padded out hesitantly, their small paws clicking on the frozen floor. They no longer growled, but their ears twitched constantly, reacting to every sound. Elias noticed that the smallest cub, the one that had sought warmth, stayed closer to him, circling near his boots but not touching him. The instructor observed from behind his visor, noting every movement. "Proceed," he ordered, his tone sharp. The other cadets advanced cautiously, some crouching to appear less threatening, others trying to emit calming scents or resonance patterns. The cubs sniffed the air, confused by the mix of alien stimuli. One of them, the larger, more aggressive cub from earlier, bared its teeth at a crystalline cadet who emitted a pulse too loud. A hiss followed, and a blur of movement ended with the cadet stumbling backward, his surface fracturing in thin cracks. The temperature dropped again, and the lighting dimmed slightly. The conditions were unbearable. Elias's hands ached from cold, and even his breath seemed to freeze against his lips. The cubs began pacing faster, their bodies trembling not from aggression, but from the chill. He could see their ribs move sharply with every breath. Varkesh adjusted the environmental controls again, speaking to his assistants through the comlink embedded in his armor. "Record metabolic responses. Increase cold flow by 10%, he said without looking at the cadets. Elias's eyes followed the smallest cub as it began to stumble slightly, its paws slipping on the frost. The others showed similar distress, flattened ears, lowered tails, trembling muscles. It wasn't dominance testing anymore. It was cruelty disguised as research. Elias clenched his jaw but stayed silent, watching for any cue from Varkesh. When none came, he acted on instinct. He lowered himself to one knee, slowly removing the thermal wrap from his shoulders again. The warmth escaped instantly, biting through his clothes, but he spread the cloth wide across the floor. The cub noticed the movement and paused. It stared for several seconds, head tilted, nostrils flaring. Then it limped forward and pressed itself onto the fabric, curling its small body in the center. The sight drew murmurs from the cadets. One of the reptilian students whispered something about contamination, but Elias ignored it. The cub's body shivered violently at first, then settled into small, steady breaths. Varkesh turned sharply, his eyes narrowing. "Human, did I authorize interference?" he hissed. Elias met his gaze and replied quietly, "No, sir, but the cub's body temperature is dropping below survivable range." "It is not your concern to decide what is survivable," Varkesh snapped. He turned to the console again. "Increase atmospheric pressure. Let us see if your compassion survives physics." The vents roared, filling the hall with denser, colder air. Frost began forming on Elias's eyebrows, but he didn't move. He extended his arms slightly, cupping his hands near the cub to trap as much heat as possible. The creature's sides rose and fell with slower rhythm now. The other cubs began approaching too, drawn by the faint warmth radiating from the cloth. Soon, all three huddled together on the blanket, pressing against one another. Elias felt their tremors through his knees. He didn't speak, didn't attempt to pet them, only breathed steadily and let his body heat work. The silence that followed was so complete that even the hum of the environmental vents seemed distant. Varkesh stood rigid, his tail flicking in irritation. The readouts on his console showed stable vitals for the cubs, but lower aggression indicators than expected. He slammed his clawed hand against the surface, making the display flicker. "You misunderstand the lesson, human," he said coldly. "You are not here to comfort beasts. You are here to command them." "Command starts with understanding," Elias said, his voice quiet but firm. The instructor turned, his golden eyes narrowing into slits. "And when understanding fails?" "Then control was never real to begin with," Elias replied. A long silence followed. The other cadets exchanged uncertain glances, unsure whether to admire his courage or fear the instructor's response. Varkesh's nostrils flared, releasing a faint hiss of irritation. Then, without warning, he pressed a control that shut off the heaters entirely. The faint hum of temperature regulators died, and the hall plunged into deep, unnatural silence. The cold intensified so quickly that the air itself seemed to crack. Elias felt pain shoot through his fingertips. The cubs whimpered and pressed closer together, one of them pushing its head against his thigh in instinctive search for heat. His heart thudded painfully in his chest, but he did not flinch. He adjusted the edges of the blanket, wrapping it loosely around the small cluster of bodies. His breath came out in shallow bursts, each one clouding before his face. Minutes crawled by. The cadets were visibly shaking, their breath fogging their helmets and visors. Varkesh finally spoke again, voice low and almost serpentine. "Fascinating. The cubs have entered thermic dependency on you. That makes them useless as predators. Your actions have corrupted the experiment." "Maybe," Elias answered through chattering teeth. "You taught the wrong lesson." Varkesh's eyes glowed faintly in the dim light, but he said nothing more. He turned away, speaking to his assistants in his native tongue. The temperature began to rise slowly, and the vents released warm air again, melting the frost that had gathered across the students' armor. The cubs stirred restlessly, but did not move away from Elias. The moment the heat returned, they sighed in unison, curling into a single tangle of fur against his legs. Elias felt a strange mix of exhaustion and quiet triumph. The instructor dismissed the class without another word, leaving the human kneeling in silence long after the others had filed out. The last thing he saw before the doors closed was Varkesh standing at the console, staring at the monitor that displayed the cub's vital signs. The reptilian's reflection shimmered faintly against the glass, his expression unreadable. Elias didn't care about the data. All he knew was that the creatures at his feet were alive and calm. When he finally rose, his knees cracked from stiffness, and the blanket slid away. The cubs opened their eyes and blinked up at him, quiet and trusting. He whispered softly, "You'll be all right." Then he turned off the hall lights and left, unaware that the surveillance system still recorded the steady rise of the cub's body heat long after he was gone. The next morning began before the sun lamp cycle reached full brightness. The academy's corridors were nearly empty, filled only with the low hum of circulating air and the faint vibration of the moon's geothermal stabilizers beneath the floors. Elias walked in silence toward the xenobiology wing, clutching the thermal blanket that had now become stained with frost marks and faint streaks of fur. He hadn't slept much. The images of the cubs pressing against him for warmth had followed him into his dreams, their small bodies trembling, their trust fragile and undeserved. The academy prided itself on mastering the laws of survival, but to him, mastery had begun to look a lot like cruelty. When he reached the entrance to the survival hall, the doors were sealed with red status lights flashing faintly above them. A security drone hovered near the ceiling, scanning for clearance badges. Elias pressed his wristband against the console, but it beeped in denial, "Access restricted pending instructor authorization," said a mechanical voice. He frowned, taking a step back. Through the narrow slit of reinforced glass in the door, he could see shadows moving inside, technicians in cold suits, adjusting equipment, and a pair of Varkin handlers wearing reinforced gloves. The cubs were inside again. He could hear faint scratching and low whines that carried through the vents. Commander Varkesh was standing by the main console, his tall frame silhouetted by the cold blue light of the monitors. Even from outside, Elias could see the tension in the reptilian's stance. Varkesh's tail lashed once, a sign of irritation. Elias hesitated, then knocked softly on the glass. The motion caught Varkesh's attention. The instructor turned sharply, his golden eyes flashing. For several seconds he simply stared through the barrier, expression unreadable. Then the red light turned green, and the doors slid open with a hiss. "Human," Varkesh said, his tone clipped and cold. "You are not scheduled for this session." Elias stepped inside slowly. "I heard the cubs were moved here again," he said. "I wanted to check if they're all right." Varkesh's nostrils flared, releasing a thin mist of condensation. "They are subjects of study, not pets." Elias met his gaze without flinching. Subjects still feel pain. For a long moment, neither moved. The technicians continued their silent work, taking samples from the metal flooring where the cubs had rested. The creatures were confined behind transparent barriers now, pacing restlessly. When one saw Elias, it paused, pressing its paw against the glass. Varkesh noticed and narrowed his eyes. "That," he hissed, "is precisely the problem." He gestured toward the monitors displaying the cubs' biometric data, heart rate, body temperature, stress levels. "Their behavioral patterns have shifted entirely since your interference. They respond to no dominant stimuli, no fear triggers, no authority. They recognize only you. You have compromised their conditioning." Elias took a step closer to the barrier, looking at the cubs. The smallest one tilted its head, its eyes bright with curiosity. "Maybe what you call conditioning isn't what they need," he said quietly. "Maybe survival doesn't come from fear." Varkesh turned sharply, his claws scraping against the floor. "Do not presume to lecture me on survival, human. My species has survived extinction cycles by mastering fear. It is the foundation of obedience. Remove fear, and chaos follows." His voice rose with each word until it echoed across the hall. The cubs flinched at the sound. Elias's jaw tightened. "And yet your lesson yesterday ended with calm, not chaos," he said. "You saw the readings yourself. Their vitals stabilized. Their aggression vanished. They trusted." "Trust is weakness," Varkesh snapped. "It cannot exist in nature." "It can," Elias replied, his tone steady. "You just don't want to see it." The room fell silent. The technicians had frozen mid-motion, unsure whether to continue. Varkesh's tail coiled tightly around his leg, the tip flicking like a whip. His eyes glowed faintly under the overhead light. "You will not interfere again," he said finally, his voice low and precise. "Your presence disrupts the experiment. You are to report to the main wing and remain there until further notice." He gestured toward the door. Elias didn't move. His gaze lingered on the cubs, who were now pressing closer to the barrier, their noses leaving small patches of fog on the glass. One of them emitted a low, plaintive sound, something between a growl and a whimper. Varkesh noticed the sound and turned to the technicians. "Increase isolation. No visual contact with external stimuli." The panels darkened instantly, cutting off the view. Elias's chest tightened with frustration. "You're punishing them for responding to care," he said quietly. "You're teaching them that comfort is wrong." Varkesh didn't answer. He pressed another command, and the hum of the oxygen filters grew louder. "Leave," he said. Elias opened his mouth to protest, but the words caught in his throat. He turned instead and walked toward the exit. As the doors slid shut behind him, he could still hear the faint scratching from inside. Soft, rhythmic, almost like the cubs were calling after him. He stopped in the corridor and leaned against the wall, exhaling slowly. His breath fogged in the air, then disappeared. The sound of footsteps approached from behind. It was Dr. Rena Millar, a xenopsychologist from the Academy's research division. She was small and wiry, with violet eyes that shimmered faintly in the light. "You were in Varkesh's lab again," she said, not as a question, but as a fact. Elias nodded. "He's freezing them to test stress tolerance." "He's always done that," she replied. "His methods are unpleasant but effective. His students graduate alive." Elias looked up sharply. "At what cost?" Rena hesitated, studying his expression. "You're not the first human to question him," she said finally. "But you're the first one to make his subjects choose warmth over obedience. That frightens him." "He's not afraid of me," Elias said bitterly. "He's afraid of losing control." Rena folded her arms. Control is everything to him. He was raised during the Great Famine on Sarash Prime. His entire colony survived by sacrificing emotion for efficiency. He doesn't believe empathy can exist without failure. Elias absorbed her words quietly. "Then maybe it's time someone proves him wrong." Rena gave a faint, tired smile. "Be careful, Elias. Varkesh's pride is older than your species' spaceflight. If he thinks you're undermining him, he'll make an example of you." She turned and walked down the corridor, leaving him alone with the low hum of the ventilation. He stayed there for a long time, staring at the sealed doors. When he finally returned to his quarters, the room felt unbearably silent. He set the thermal blanket on his bed and stared at it, remembering the weight of the cubs against his legs, their trust so simple and undeserved. The idea of leaving them alone under Varkesh's control felt wrong. He spent hours pacing before he made a decision. That night, long after curfew, Elias crept back through the service corridors that ran beneath the xenobiology wing. The path was narrow and dim, lined with conduits that pulsed faint blue light. His wristband flickered every few meters as it interfered with the security grid. He moved quietly, keeping close to the wall, until he reached the maintenance hatch that led into the survival hall's observation chamber. He could see through the transparent panel that the cubs were still awake, huddled together under the dim emergency light. The air inside shimmered faintly with cold. He pressed his palm against the glass. For a moment, one of the cubs lifted its head, eyes glinting gold in the dark. The sound it made was soft, barely audible, but it filled him with a sudden, fierce resolve. He whispered through the barrier, his voice low enough that no sensor could detect it. "I'll find a way to get you out of there." The cub blinked slowly, then lowered its head again, curling closer to its siblings. Elias stepped back into the corridor, his heart pounding. He knew what he was planning was reckless. He also knew he was going to do it anyway. The moon's artificial night stretched endlessly around him, but for the first time since arriving at the academy, he no longer felt small. He felt angry, and that anger was starting to turn into purpose. Elias spent the following day in restless silence, pretending to study in the Academy's archive chamber, while his mind stayed fixed on the sealed hall beneath the xenobiology wing. The cubs were still locked there, under Varkesh's control, and every minute felt like betrayal. He had already made his decision during the sleepless night before, but he needed to understand the security system first. The archives held decades of training records, including technical manuals for the Academy's containment chambers. Using his clearance as a senior cadet, he accessed the schematics under the pretext of researching environmental adaptation procedures. The system logs displayed long strings of code, thermal cycle routines, and emergency override sequences. Most were restricted, but his eyes caught one crucial line of text: manual release authorization, dual scan, instructor plus auxiliary. It meant Varkesh wasn't the only one who could open those doors. Every experiment had an auxiliary controller for emergency retrieval. He had seen it once, in the control room's upper platform. That was his way in. As the artificial dusk settled across the Academy dome, the corridors emptied. Students drifted back to their quarters, the hum of conversation fading behind steel doors. Elias waited until the motion sensors dimmed to night mode, then slipped into the maintenance wing. The air was colder here, laced with metallic dust. He wore a standard technician's uniform, grey and featureless, and carried a small toolkit to blend in. His heart beat a steady rhythm against his ribs, fast but controlled. He had memorized the patrol schedule from the hall monitors. The sentry drones passed through the lower corridor every 6 minutes, leaving a 2-minute blind zone. He moved during that gap, pressing his back to the wall whenever the faint whirring echoed down the passage. The auxiliary hatch was smaller than he remembered, almost invisible under a web of frost. He scraped at the surface gently until the biometric panel lit with a soft blue glow. His pulse jumped when the display flickered. Access restricted. Supervisor verification required. He exhaled slowly and reached into his toolkit, pulling out the multispectral scanner he had borrowed from the repair lab. It wasn't designed to hack Academy systems, but he had modified the signal converter earlier that day to mimic Instructor-grade thermal signatures. When he pressed it against the panel, the light hesitated, then turned green. The hatch slid open with a whisper of released air. Inside, the service passage was narrow and steep, lined with cables that pulsed faintly like veins beneath translucent casing. Elias descended carefully, each step echoing in the cold shaft. The faint rumble of generators vibrated through the metal. At the bottom, he reached the secondary observation deck overlooking the survival hall. It was darker than before, lit only by the faint glow of containment barriers below. The cubs were there, 3 small figures curled in the corner of the enclosure, motionless at first. But as he stepped closer to the glass, one lifted its head. Its golden eyes caught the light, reflecting it like molten amber. A quiet sound escaped it, almost a chirp of recognition. Elias pressed his hand against the glass instinctively. The cub rose shakily and padded toward him. The others followed, slower but awake now, their tails flicking weakly. He looked around for the auxiliary controls. They were set into a wall console above his head, encased in transparent shielding. The screen displayed lines of diagnostic data and the familiar lock warning. Manual override disabled during active session. His jaw tightened. Varkesh must have left the system in lockdown mode after the last experiment. There was only one way to bypass it: trigger a false emergency. He removed the access panel from the lower console and found the coolant regulator node. The system relied on maintaining a stable thermal balance between the hall and the control chamber. If he caused a minor fluctuation, the safety protocols would assume a breach and temporarily disable the primary lock. He hesitated for only a moment, then began rerouting the cable connections. Sparks hissed softly as he twisted the final wire into place. The room lights flickered, and a low alarm pulse vibrated through the floor. "Temperature deviation detected," said the automated voice overhead. "Initiating environmental stabilization." The main barrier shimmered, then dimmed to half opacity. A new prompt appeared on the console. "Override authorized. Auxiliary release available." Elias reached for the activation key. His hand shook slightly, but his breath stayed steady. He pressed his palm to the scanner. The locks disengaged with a metallic hiss, and the barrier lowered halfway. A rush of cold air escaped into the observation deck. The cubs reacted instantly. They tensed for a moment, uncertain, then scented the familiar presence. The smallest one, the same that had slept against his leg, moved first, padding cautiously through the gap. Its claws clicked softly on the metal floor as it approached him. When it reached him, it paused, sniffed his hand, and leaned into his palm. The warmth of its skin was faint but alive. He crouched down, brushing his fingers gently along its neck. The others followed, stepping through the opening with slow, deliberate movements. He guided them into the service corridor, wrapping the thermal blanket around their backs to shield them from the cold air. The escape would have been almost silent, if not for the voice that broke through the intercom above him. "Step away from the containment gate, Cadet Ward." The words struck him like a physical blow. He froze, eyes darting toward the upper observation platform. Varkesh stood there, his silhouette sharp against the glow of the monitors. His golden eyes gleamed through the glass like twin suns. I wondered how long your compassion would wait before turning to defiance, he said, descending the stairwell with slow, deliberate steps. Elias straightened, placing himself instinctively between the instructor and the cubs. You're torturing them, he said. You're turning them into weapons when they could be companions. Varkesh stopped a few meters away, his claws curling slightly. Weapons survive, he said. Companions die. His voice was calm, almost pitying. Your empathy blinds you. You think mercy is strength, but it breeds weakness. Look at them, soft, dependent, unable to act without you. You've stripped them of what they were meant to be. Elias shook his head. You're wrong. I didn't strip them of anything. I gave them a choice. Varkesh's expression hardened. A choice? His voice grew sharper, the word cutting like glass. Animals do not choose. They obey. That is the law of survival. The universe is built on fear, human. It is the oldest truth. Elias took a step closer. Maybe fear built your world. It doesn't have to build ours. The silence that followed was suffocating. The only sound was the soft hum of the vents and the faint whimper of the cubs behind him. Varkesh moved first. In a blur of motion, his clawed hand shot forward, slamming the control panel on the wall. The barrier gates sealed instantly, cutting off the exit behind Elias. The emergency alarms blared as the hall's temperature began to plunge again. Frost swept across the walls in spiderweb patterns. You see, human, Varkesh hissed, advancing. When mercy fails, nature reclaims control. Elias stepped back, pulling the blanket tighter around the cubs. The smallest one shivered violently, pressing closer to his legs. The air was dropping fast, visible as thin vapor streaming from their mouths. Varkesh stood tall, unmoved by the cold. Leave them, he said. Step aside, and I will let you live. Elias met his gaze steadily. I'm not leaving them. Something flickered behind Varkesh's eyes. Not anger this time, but curiosity, as if he were studying an anomaly he could not quantify. You would die for them. Elias didn't answer. He pulled the cubs close and wrapped the blanket around all three. The air around him shimmered with frost, coating his hair and lashes with silver. Varkesh's voice lowered to a whisper. So be it. He turned toward the console to activate the purge sequence that would drop the hall's temperature to lethal levels. But before he could press the control, one of the cubs let out a sound unlike any previous cry. A deep, guttural roar that vibrated through the chamber. The sound froze Varkesh mid-motion. The cub, trembling with cold, stood between the two figures, its fur bristling, its eyes blazing with reflected light. The other two rose beside it, mirroring its stance. Elias stayed still, his breath fogging. The cubs didn't attack. They didn't retreat. They simply stood, shielding him. Varkesh stared in silence. For the first time, the lesson he had built his life on cracked. The predators he believed would serve only fear had chosen loyalty instead. He slowly lowered his hand from the console. The alarms continued to wail, but neither moved. The cubs' breathing filled the silence, a slow, steady rhythm that drowned out the hum of machinery. Finally, Varkesh deactivated the alarm. The temperature stabilized, though the frost remained thick. His voice, when he spoke again, was quieter than Elias had ever heard it. Perhaps I misjudged the parameters, he said. Perhaps survival has more than one definition. Elias didn't answer. He knelt again, letting the cubs press against him. Their warmth, faint but alive, seeped into his frozen hands. Varkesh turned away without another word, walking back toward the upper platform. His steps echoed like fading thunder in the empty hall. When the emergency lights dimmed to calm white, Elias finally exhaled. The cubs relaxed beside him, curling close. The hum of the vents softened, the air returning to its normal chill. He looked at the sealed exit and knew that nothing about this place would ever be the same again. The Academy had witnessed something it could not categorize, a moment when instinct bowed not to fear, but to trust. And though he didn't yet know the cost, Elias understood one thing with absolute clarity. What had happened tonight could not be undone. When the emergency systems finally shut down and silence reclaimed the survival hall, Elias remained on the frozen floor, his body trembling from exhaustion and cold. The cubs lay close to him, their breathing steady, their fur faintly steaming as the warmth slowly returned. The metallic tang of frost still lingered in the air, mixed with the low hum of restored ventilation. He barely registered the passing of time. It might have been minutes or hours before the hall doors slid open and a team of administrators entered, accompanied by Dr. Rena Malar and 2 members of the Ethics Commission. Behind them, Varkesh stood silent, his posture rigid but not defiant. The air in the room felt heavy with the unspoken weight of what had just occurred. Rena approached first, kneeling beside Elias with visible concern. Her voice was soft but urgent. "You need medical attention," she said. "Your core temperature is dangerously low." He shook his head, his voice hoarse. "I'll live." His eyes drifted to the cubs. "Make sure they do too." She followed his gaze and nodded faintly. The ethics officers exchanged quiet words with Varkesh before ordering the technicians to escort the cubs to the xenobiology infirmary. None resisted. As the creatures were carried out in insulated containment units, Elias noticed that one of them, the smallest, pressed its paw against the glass as it passed him. He reached out instinctively, touching the surface in silent acknowledgement. The gesture, brief and simple, carried more meaning than any words could. Varkesh stood apart from the others, arms folded behind his back. When the last of the technicians left, the reptilian instructor turned his gaze toward Elias. His expression was unreadable. "You risked your life," he said slowly, his voice lower than usual, "for creatures that would have devoured you under any other circumstance." Elias met his gaze evenly. Maybe that's what makes it matter. The silence that followed felt different this time, less hostile, almost reflective. Varkesh's tail flicked once before he spoke again. "The Ethics Council will demand an explanation," he said. "They may revoke my license. Perhaps that is fitting." He paused, his eyes narrowing slightly. "But understand this, human. You did not win. You changed the parameters of the experiment. You forced nature to show a side it rarely does." He took a step closer, his voice softening. "I cannot decide yet whether that was brilliance or folly." Elias didn't respond. His body felt heavy, his strength nearly spent. The conversation ended as quietly as it began, and Varkesh left without another word. In the days that followed, the academy transformed. Whispers of the incident spread across every division, of the human who had tamed Varkin predators through warmth instead of dominance, of the instructor who had nearly killed his students in pursuit of control, and of the cubs that had chosen to protect rather than attack. The administration launched a full investigation. Rena was assigned to supervise the inquiry, and she spent hours interviewing Elias in the infirmary. She never pressed him harshly, only asked questions that seemed to balance curiosity with disbelief. "When the cubs stood between you and Varkesh," she asked once, "did you feel fear?" Elias thought for a long time before answering. "No," he said finally. "Only clarity. Fear ends when you stop seeing yourself as separate from the others." The statement found its way into her final report. Weeks later, the council concluded the hearings. Varkesh was suspended indefinitely, pending reassignment to a research colony. His methods were condemned as outdated and incompatible with evolving galactic ethics. Yet his record of survival training remained unmatched, and his departure divided opinion among the faculty. Some said he had been a necessary evil. Others called him a relic of a violent past. Varkesh himself left quietly, without ceremony or farewell, vanishing into the transport vessel that took him off the lunar campus. Elias watched the departure from the observation dome. He didn't feel victory, only a strange sense of peace that came from knowing that change, even painful change, had begun. The cubs remained under medical supervision for several weeks. During that time, Elias visited them daily. The xenobiology wing had turned one of its glass labs into a controlled habitat, warmer and more natural than the sterile hall where everything began. Each time he entered, the cubs would lift their heads, recognizing his scent instantly. The smallest one always reached him first, pressing its nose against his hand, its golden eyes bright and trusting. He would sit beside the enclosure for hours, speaking softly while they ate or slept. The bond between them deepened quietly, witnessed only by Rena, who often observed from a distance, making notes in her digital pad. One afternoon, as Elias finished recording a set of behavioral readings, Rena approached him with a subtle smile. "You should see this," she said, holding up a datapad. It displayed a notice from the Academy's research board. "Your field report has been approved for publication. They're calling it the empathy response in non-dominant predators." He blinked in surprise. "They're publishing it?" She nodded. "Under your name, with my co-signature. The Council believes your results could redefine xenopsychological approaches to interspecies training." She paused, studying his face. "That's what you wanted, isn't it? To change something." He looked back at the cubs through the glass. "I didn't want to change anything," he said softly. "I just wanted them to be free." Over the following months, the report spread across scientific networks throughout the Galactic Federation. Some scholars dismissed it as sentimental nonsense, calling it anthropocentric idealism. But others saw it as a turning point, a new way of understanding cooperation between species long considered unbridgeable. The Academy eventually introduced new curriculum modules based on his methods, titled Symbiotic Trust Exercises. Elias was assigned as one of the assistant instructors, though he refused to replicate Varkesh's authoritarian style. His lessons took place outdoors, under simulated sunlight, with cadets of many species learning not just survival, but coexistence. One evening, after the last training session ended, he returned to the habitat chamber. The cubs had grown visibly larger, their bodies stronger, their fur darker with maturity. When he entered, they greeted him with low, rumbling sounds that resembled contented purrs. He knelt as the smallest of them approached, now almost reaching his chest when standing. The creature pressed its head against his shoulder, and he wrapped his arms around its neck, feeling the steady rhythm of its breath. "You don't need me anymore," he whispered. "That's how I know I did it right." Rena entered quietly behind him. "The Council approved the relocation program," she said. "The cubs will be released into the rehabilitation reserve on Vega 12 next week. Open terrain, temperate climate, no containment." Elias nodded, still stroking the creature's fur. "It's where they belong." She hesitated for a moment before adding, "They've also offered you a position as field liaison to monitor the adaptation process." He smiled faintly. "I think I'll go." When the day of departure came, the entire xenobiology department gathered at the shuttle bay. The 3 Varkin cubs were escorted in temperature-controlled pods, calm and alert. As the crew prepared the vessel, one of the cubs began to whine softly, pressing against the barrier until the mechanism released a small opening. Elias stepped forward and placed his hand through the gap. The cub leaned in, brushing its snout against his palm. For a moment, the noise of engines and announcements faded. It was just him and the creatures who had changed everything. Not just their own fate, but his understanding of what survival could mean. When the shuttle rose into the pale light of the lunar dawn, he stood beside Rena, watching until it vanished beyond the horizon. The hum of the engines lingered in the thin air, fading into silence. Rena turned to him. "Do you think they'll remember you?" she asked. He smiled faintly. "Maybe, but that's not the point. What matters is that they'll remember what warmth felt like. That's enough." Months later, the first transmission arrived from Vega 12. The rehabilitation team reported that the Varkin adapted successfully. No aggression, no regression, no dependency. The trio had established a new pack structure, sharing dens and hunting cooperatively. Their behavior described as unusually cohesive for their species. The scientists attributed it to altered social imprints, but Elias knew better. He read the report in silence, then closed the file and stared out the observation window at the endless field of stars. The academy had returned to its routines: lectures, training drills, assessments. But something fundamental had shifted beneath its cold efficiency. The students now spoke of empathy as a skill, not a flaw. The words "ward protocol" began to circulate quietly among instructors. Even Varkesh's name became part of the lesson, an emblem of what the old order once believed. As Elias stood beneath the artificial sky that glowed faint blue over the academy dome, he realized that no act of compassion was ever wasted, not even in a universe that taught survival through dominance. The cubs had proven that warmth could rewrite instinct, that trust could outlast fear. And for the first time since he had stepped onto the cold soil of Kirulth, he felt that perhaps the galaxy, vast and divided as it was, might one day learn the same. He turned from the window and walked down the corridor toward the training fields, his reflection gliding alongside him in the polished steel. The air was warmer than usual, the hum of the vents softer. Somewhere deep below, in a quiet lab, 3 small paw prints remained frozen into the floor of the old survival hall, a silent reminder that the lesson had never been about control at all, but about connection. And for Elias Ward, that was the true victory, that something born of fear had ended in peace, and that peace, once awakened, could never again be contained.